talking about the goal of today's session, I want to familiarize you all with what color contrast requirements are and best practices are when it comes to digital content. So this is both for our website owners and our digital content managers. Sometimes those aren't the same people. So I will be giving an overview on what digital accessibility is. Some of you may be familiar with this from other sessions that we've hosted in the recent past, but some of you might be learning about this for the first time. So I wanted to give you a quick overview about what digital accessibility is and what it covers before we start actually getting into what color contrast is in relation to digital accessibility, the requirements for it. We're going to also look at some examples. And then I'll also show you some tools that you can use to design and test for color contrast. And then we'll just talk about, what you can do as content managers now that you have this information. So, what is digital accessibility? It is the standards and practices used to ensure that digital content is accessible to all users, regardless of the device that they're using or any visual, hearing, cognitive, or motor impairments. And so this could mean anybody who maybe can't see the screen for some reason. They might be blind. They might have a color blindness issue, which plays in directly to what we're going to be talking about today. It could also mean somebody who can't use a mouse. They might have a motor disability, they might have an injury, or they might actually not even have the limbs appropriate to use a mouse. You don't really know what their circumstances are, so we have to take that into account for digital content that we create. I already mentioned users who maybe can't see the screen for some reason, but it could also be a technical limitation. So somebody who's on a low bandwidth network might have issues using your website if the content on your website has not been optimized for all of your users. So these are just some of the use cases that are covered by digital accessibility. It is by no means exhaustive, but these are just some of the most common ones that we think about as we are creating these platforms and programs for you guys, and as we provide you with recommendations and tutorials on how to create your digital content. So still talking about what is digital accessibility. The standards for digital accessibility are defined by the World Wide Web Consortium, and you'll often hear them referred to as W3C. And they are known as the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG guidelines. And there are 3 levels for WCAG compliance. There is A, which is the lowest threshold, AA, and AAA. And the difference between the 3 levels, basically determining if you are compliant for one level or the other, is how easily can you as a content creator or content manager implement a given set of standards and best practices, and how easily can the end user actually interact with your digital content using their chosen device or their chosen method. So those two things are what determine whether or not you're single A compliant, AA compliant, or AAA compliant, or just not compliant at all. The university is striving for a WCAG 2.1 AA compliance, and more information about what we are doing to meet those standards can be found on the Accessibility at GW website. And it covers everything from what can faculty members be doing for the content that they're creating for their courses, what can website managers and content managers be doing to make sure the content that we're putting out is accessible, as well as other use cases throughout the university. So what does digital accessibility cover? Basically, in this day and age, it covers just about everything that you're going to encounter. So anything that is used to provide or consume digital information is covered by digital accessibility. So websites and blogs, applications for desktop, web, and mobile, social media content, digital signage, digital downloads. We love our PDF documents and flyers. Those are covered by digital accessibility, and online videos. All of those things are covered by the compliance requirements for digital content. And just as with the use cases, this list is not exhaustive, but these are just the most common ones that we encounter at the university. So all of these things need to be audited for digital accessibility, and you need to be, as you're creating new content, keeping digital accessibility standards and compliance requirements in mind as you're creating content for any of these mediums. So speaking specifically about color contrast, As defined by Wikipedia, contrast is the difference in luminance or color that makes an object or its representation in an image distinguishable. In visual perception of the real world, contrast is determined by the difference in the color and the brightness of an object and the other objects within the same field of view. So basically what that's saying is, how easily can you tell one object from another when they are against the same background and foreground. So getting a little more technical with it for accessible color contrast, there are actually ratios defined, numeric ratios defined for what you need to hit for any two colors to be accessible against each other. So, and it gets pretty technical. I tried to simplify it a little bit here, but what WCAG has done is said that for regular text, and that's just text that, is just like your regular paragraph text, the ratio needs to be 4.5 to 1 for the background and foreground color. And again, that's just for like your regular paragraph text. Now, if your text is bigger, the requirements get a little bit looser because typically when something is bigger, it's easier to see. So if you have large text on your page, and large text for WCAG compliance requirements is defined as anything that's 14 points or higher and bolded, it needs to be a 3 to 1 ratio between the background and the foreground color. However, this can also apply to text within images, which is something that we do a lot at the university. You need to make sure that there's enough color contrast between the background color on your image and any text that's on your image. And then it's also applies to any graphic elements that you might have on your page or a digital signage, whatever the case might be. And especially if there's something critical in the graphic that is represented by color. And we'll take a couple of looks at some examples of what I mean by that. But just to throw one out there really quickly, think of charts. If you have a chart and you're trying to differentiate the different information in your chart with colors, that's the kind of thing where you need to start thinking about the color contrast if this is a chart that's going to be represented digitally to your users. So some other color considerations to keep in mind. You don't want to use color alone to indicate that something is interactive, such as a link. On the platforms that my team manages, and my team being marketing and creative services, we make sure that if we manage the GW Drupal platform, we also manage the GW Blogs platform, and we've made sure that for the styles that we have put in the templates for those two platforms, that they are accessible. So for instance, in GW Drupal, it used to be that it was color alone that indicated that something was a link, but when we realized that that was insufficient for accessibility needs, we actually added an underline style. There's also a hover style in there that changes the look of the link so that a user can know that they actually are interacting with that link if they mouse over it. So that's one example of how you don't want to use color alone to indicate that something is interactive. You also don't want to use color alone to convey information. So in this example, it's red, yellow, and green, which are pretty common uses for status indicators a number of times. If you want to say a service is up or down, something like that, we'll just make it red, yellow, or green depending on the status of that service. Unfortunately, that's insufficient for users who maybe have a color blindness issue that they're dealing with. They need some other way to know that the status of whatever that service is other than that color. So those are just some things to keep in mind when you are designing for any sort of digital content about how you convey information to your users. Speaking specifically of the GW color palette, while it does include accessible options, we are aware that there are also combinations that may not be accessible together. And I'm going to share that color palette with you guys in the follow-up resources, and we'll take a look at what that document looks like as well. But it's sort of a living document. As the color contrast requirements maybe evolved from the W3C, we make sure to make updates to that as well. And we are aware that our current color palette is not 100% accessible. We are working on that with our design team, and something that we're hoping to have updated for you guys by the fall. But we are going to share what we have with you for now, and it does include accessible color combinations that you can use for any sort of design assets that you have to put out for your digital content. And I want to kind of stop for a moment and just let you know that these are specific to digital content. The color contrast requirements for print are completely different. I don't actually know what they are off the top of my head. So if you have a document that was designed or created for print, you can't necessarily then just throw it up on your website and expect for it to still be accessible for your end users that are now getting it from a digital device, because the requirements between the two are actually different. So keep that in mind. If you have a document that was initially created for print and you've now decided we want to put it up on our website so it's accessible and available to our users on the website as well, go back and test those documents and make sure that they are meeting color contrast requirements for digital content accessibility. Getting back into the GW color palette, we know that our standard light blue is not accessible as a background color with white text. The same thing with our standard buff color. So if you have anything that is using our standard GW color palette and you have questions about whether or not it's compliant, you can reach out to our office and we can help you take a look at that to see if it's compliant. And there are also some tools, again, that I will show you at the end of this session that you can use to see for yourself if those color combinations are compliant. So here are some examples of the GW color palette currently that are not compliant. So I mentioned earlier, we know that the GW buff with the white text, which you can see in this first upper left square, we know that this is not compliant either for regular text or for large text. The light blue, the cyan, and with white text, we also know that this one for regular text is not compliant. For large text, because it's bigger, if it's bold and bigger font, it actually is more easily discerned against that cyan light blue background. So for the large text, it can pass if you have the text big enough, basically, but you do need to make sure that your text is big enough. You also need to make sure that the font weight is bold. That's the only way it's going to pass compliance. But as you can see here, and by the way, the reason why I chose these examples is because these are actually some of the ones we most commonly see. We ourselves have used this light blue cyan background color with white text in the past. When we learned it wasn't compliant, we moved away from doing that, but there are a number of website owners and digital content managers out there who are either doing in-house design or who maybe have contracted externally to have something built for a specific need that you have. And we've seen on some of these applications and websites and blogs and mobile apps and whatnot that some of these color combinations are being used. So we just wanted you guys to be aware, we know that these color combinations are not accessible for users from a color contrast perspective. So again, that's the GW buff background with white text, that light blue cyan background with white text, the GW blue background with the buff text. We've seen that one as well. It will pass, just like the cyan and white did. It will pass for large text, but for regular text, it is not compliant. Same for the buff background with the GW blue, the light blue cyan with the GW blue for text, and then the GW blue background with the cyan for text. All of these, it kind of seems like, yeah, I can read it. It's good. This should work. But when you're looking at web accessibility, and remember, you have to meet those specific ratios for contrast between your background color and your text color, these combinations actually will not pass. They will fail AA compliance for users who maybe have a visual impairment, whether that be complete color blindness or maybe blurry vision, something along those lines. These color combinations wouldn't pass. So what could you do to resolve that issue? You could swap out the standard hex color value, and for digital content creation, the colors are defined by what's called the hex color value, and I'll show you kind of what those look like in a few moments. But you can swap them out with approved darker versions that will pass the color contrast requirements. So for instance, we have slightly different variations of each one of these colors that we know will pass accessibility for a given use case, and we swap them out as necessary. I know that there's this perception that the use of the GW color palette is very, very strict, and you have to use just this one color and only this one color, but you have to be a little bit more lenient when it comes to digital accessibility. You have to be willing to tweak those colors a little bit so that we can be inclusive of everybody. So we do have slightly darker versions or lighter versions, if necessary, of several of the GW colors in the GW color palette that can be used in place of the standards so that you can meet digital accessibility color contrast requirements. Another thing that you can do is just use different color combinations altogether. So I mentioned previously we used to use this cyan background with white text, but when we realized it wasn't working, we just stopped using it. We moved to a different type of color combination. So sometimes we have to just say, you know what, I really love the way these two colors look, but they just don't work. And a tweet that I saw earlier today that I love and I will share with you guys is beauty is important, but usability is the priority. So if something just doesn't work, we have to be able to say, I'm just not going to use it as much as I love it. I just can't use it because it's not meeting the requirements that I am required to meet for digital accessibility color contrast. So another example, which I alluded to this one earlier, is charts. Charts are a big issue. I won't say issue, that's not a good word, but charts are difficult when it comes to digital accessibility for a number of reasons. But when it comes to color contrast, it's usually because color alone is being used to indicate information. And again, that is bad for digital accessibility. If I am colorblind and I'm only seeing things in grayscale, like if I'm completely colorblind, I have no idea what this line means from this line from this line. I just don't know. Even with this key over here, I can't differentiate and discern these three colors from one another if I'm only seeing it in grayscale. A similar issue, if I'm not even completely colorblind, maybe I just can't see greens very well. I still wouldn't be able to differentiate this color from these other two, or it just won't look the way that you think it's going to look for me. So, and then in addition to color being the only thing that is being used in this chart to convey information, the other thing we know for certain is that none of these colors, even though they're all in the GW color palette, will pass digital accessibility color contrast requirements against a white background. And again, that could be surprising because the general frame of mind is a white background is kind of perfect for any color that you want to put on top of it, but that's just not the case. These are too weak for some users to be able to see against a white background. So this chart would completely, it wouldn't give the information, or certain users would not be able to get the information that they needed out of it. And it really is not giving any information here. This means nothing. It's something I just put together for you guys. But you can see here with the colors that are being used for someone who has no color impairments, they're fine, but there is a much broader chunk of your audience than you realize who's actually being excluded from seeing this content simply because of the colors that were chosen. So again, what can you do about it? You can apply a unique style to each one of the lines, such as a dash, that will add an additional visual element to differentiate each track. So instead of having just single solid lines, one line can be dashes, one line can be solid, one line can maybe be dots. You know, you can kind of play around with what that's going to be. If it's something simple like the chart that you have here, that's another way that you can put in an additional visual element for those users who maybe are just partially impaired with their vision to be able to see what's going on in that chart. You can also try playing around with the value of how heavy the stroke is for each one of these lines to make it a higher value, which is going to make the line bolder and bigger and thicker. And that might make it easier for some of your users to see the difference between them while just using color alone. And then again, you can look at making the shades for each one of these lines slightly darker so that they actually are meeting accessibility compliance. Like if you don't want to make these lines any thicker, you can change the color values themselves so that they're darker and will then maybe meet the color contrast requirements against this white background. Because as it is right now, not all of the users are going to be able to see the information. They're either going to be dealing with it maybe all just being black and white and grayscale, or it's just not enough contrast against that white background for them to be able to read your chart here. So how do we design and test for accessible color contrast? When it comes to design, you can actually work with Marketing Creative Services. Again, everything that we put out, we are testing for accessibility if we know that it's going to be used as a digital design asset. We make sure that the colors being used are going to meet color contrast requirements. Our team is pretty well versed at this point and learning more every day about what the requirements are and how it bleeds into design. And then we're making sure to put what we've learned into practice so that the assets that we give to you, our users, are meeting these requirements and you don't have to think about it. So definitely reach out to Marketing Creative Services for your design projects, and we will work with you to make sure that they are meeting accessibility requirements. You can also, again, use GW's predefined color palette to ensure that you're using accessible brand compliant colors. And again, that color palette is not perfect. We do know that there are some combinations that will not pass accessibility. We are always learning and making sure that we update our practices and the assets that we provide to you all to meet these compliance requirements. For the color palette document that we have available right now, it's slated to be updated this coming fall to provide the latest hex color values that will also be brand compliant and meet web accessibility color contrast requirements for level A compliance. And then something else you can use, this is WebAIM's color contrast checker. We're going to take a look at that in a few minutes. WebAIM is an organization that seeks to also provide information and tutorials for website and digital content managers. And I love that website. They provide really great information in a really easy to understand format. And then they also have this awesome tool that will allow you to check the color contrast between two colors that you might be thinking of using. And it will tell you for each compliance level whether or not you're going to pass. So that's a tool that you can use to test any two colors that you might be planning to use either as background color and text or within a graphic to see if they are going to pass accessibility standards. You can also install the Funkify browser extension. This is something that I've used in the past. I find it can be pretty eye-opening when you use it, and we are going to take a look at it in just a few minutes as well so that I can show you guys what that looks like. There are also other tools that do the same thing. So there's the Color Contrast Analyzer. There is a Windows and Mac desktop app, and there's also a Chrome browser extension. You can use them to, again, to test between different colors to see if you're meeting accessibility requirements. And then the Contrast Checker website, it's similar to the tool we're going to look at, which is WebAIMS, but I think it's slightly easier to use. So if you're new to digital accessibility and you're kind of wondering, or you're just basically starting out trying to learn and to put these things into practice, it can definitely be intimidating to look at a tool that's got a lot of technical things going on around it. So for that reason, I do feel like the Color Contrast website, the Contrast Checker website, it's a really good tool to use for a beginner. And again, it just allows you to put in two color values, and in a very easy to understand format, it tells you whether or not it passes the contrast requirements. So I'm going to share my Chrome browser screen with you all, and we're going to take a look at the Funkify browser extension, WebAIMS color contrast tool, and then the Contrast Checker website, so that you can see what's out there for you guys to use to both design for and test for color contrast in your websites. So let me share my browser with you now. Okay, so you should be seeing the About page on the main website. And as you can see here, we've basically just got a white background, different shades of the GW blue in there, some graphics going on. And then because this is the Chrome browser, I also have the Funkify tool in here. So if I open up Funkify, and I hope you guys can see this, we get a number of simulators that are available to use to let you see what somebody who might have a disability is going through when they're looking at your website. So everything from blurry vision to color issues, dyslexia, and then motor disabilities like trembling, and then another visual disability, which is tunnel toby. Now, Funkify has a free version, which is what I'm using. They do also have a paid version, which gives you more access to more filters and more simulators. So I won't have access to look at everything. But if we go to the persona here, color crawl, and we start that simulator, we can see right away how the color scale on this page has changed. You can see that, the one that we're looking at right now is the most common one, I believe, for color blindness. And I don't think I'm going to say this word right, but deuteranopia, I believe is the word. And that is red-green color blindness. You can see 1 in 100 men and 1 in 300 women have this version of color blindness. So it's a lot more common than people realize. And you can see that the colors that we were seeing before have been completely changed. If I was using any one of those two colors to just convey information, while these two are different here, like I can see pretty well the difference between these two colors, in some of the smaller places, like if you see the apply button up here against this background color here, it's not quite as different. And if the text was getting smaller or that button was smaller, it would get even more difficult to see one color against the other. And you can see just the lack of being able to see the full scale of colors available to me has changed everything about what's going on this website. And for those of us who don't have a color blindness issue, we're looking at this and thinking, this is really weird. This looks funny maybe even. But for a lot of people, this is what they see all the time. So this is what we have to keep in mind when we are designing design assets or creating digital content that is going to be using color as a part of the content delivery. We need to be thinking about that when we're designing those items for everybody. I mean, look at the way that the light and the shadow has even showed up on his jacket here. We need to be thinking about that and how that color will come into play for those users. And then we need to be making the decisions for what we put out there to make sure that we're not excluding anybody or making it more difficult for them to see what they need to see and do what they need to do on our websites and on our applications, and so on and so forth. So because, again, this is the free one, I'm not really able to switch to some of these others. Everything here used to be free, but they're now, as I mentioned previously, they have this premium version, and it's not super expensive, but for me, I only have the free level. But even this gives some good information for what my end users will see based off of the colors that I've chosen. And something else to keep in mind, if you click on the About the Simulator, many people print pages in black and white, and most ebook readers show everything in grayscale. So that's something else to keep in mind for your websites that you might be designing and other digital assets that you might be designing. If somebody has to print it out for some reason, that print is probably going to be in grayscale. So that's another reason why, even if that person did not have any sort of visual disability that they were dealing with, when they looked at it on their computer, on their phone, whatever they looked at it on, once they went to actually print it out, chances are they didn't print it out in color. They printed it out in grayscale. And you have to think about, how is that going to look once they print it out there. So that's another reason, another thing you have to keep in mind when you are using color in your digital assets and in your digital content. So that is the Funkify browser app. The next thing we're going to take a look at is the WebAIM Color Checker. So as I mentioned previously, I think this is a great tool. I think it could be a little bit intimidating for some users who have maybe never used it before or who are new to web accessibility. So what you get here excuse me, are these two boxes at the top where you can test for your foreground color, which is your text, and then your background color, which is the background color of your website or your graphic, whatever the case might be. Over here, you will see the contrast ratio, and then down here, you'll see whether or not it passes for normal text, large text, and for graphical elements. And the specific example they're using is the border color that you see here around this form field. As well as this check mark here that you see right above it. So again, for normal text, the difference between normal text and large text as defined by W3C is anything that is 14 points or higher and is also bold. That is when it's considered to be large text. And you can see there are two options or two levels that it's checking for, AA compliance and AAA compliance. It's not even looking at single A compliance because that is the lowest threshold, and I think they just expect us all to do better. So I happen to know some of our color values off the top of my head. So I'm going to start with 003 C5A, which is our dark blue. So you can see that color box right there changed. And right now, the default background color is white. So dark blue text on a white background is definitely going to pass. You can see it's got a pretty high pass ratio. If we go over here now and change this to AA9868, which is the buff color, you'll see that that contrast ratio changes. Now it's 4.12 to 1, which is enough to pass for large text. It is not enough to pass for normal paragraph text. And again, at larger text, 14 points or higher and bold, it will pass. There's enough difference between this buff background and this dark blue text that most of your users will be able to see it. But at the regular paragraph level where there's no additional styling on it, where the font point is not very high, it's not going to pass for your regular users. So this would actually fail level 2 compliance, and we would not want to use this color combination together. I could do the same thing for 0190dB. This is our light blue cyan color. And then I can change this back to just this standard white background, which is all F. And still, you can see that color contrast ratio, 3.49 to 1. It will pass for large text at the AA level. There's enough contrast between that white background and this light blue cyan color at the large text level, but it will not pass for regular paragraph text. So if we had just a chunk of text with this color combination for our users, there would be a large number of your visitors who could not read this text very easily or at all. It would not pass that AA compliance. And then you can also see down here, I didn't look at it for the last one, but if this was going to be the border color or the highlight color for an interactive object on a page or on an application, it actually would pass. They're saying, yeah, there's enough difference between these two areas and whatever that interactive maybe text is in the form field itself, there's enough difference there that it would pass. So that's really helpful to actually see that as well, because that's another design element that I think often goes overlooked. Those highlight colors for an interactive object, the rollover colors for buttons, things like that, those often get overlooked for color contrast, and that's something you need to be keeping in mind as well. We have button styles that we have designed, and some people will say they're not the prettiest buttons, which, you know, that's subjective and opinion, but we do at least know that they will pass accessibility requirements because we put the right color values in for when you're just looking at the page, and then when a mouse actually hovers over them, we have a completely different color combination, which is also on its own accessible. Like, we've made sure that those interactions at each point of the process of looking at the button, hovering over button, and clicking on the button, they're all accessible. So I do think that it's really helpful for that WebAIM has this graphical objects and user interface components pass-fail as well. So you can make sure that for those types of elements, you're making sure that they also are passing compliance. So this is another tool that you can use, and it's one of the, if not the top tool that gets recommended most often for testing color contrast compliance. But I mentioned there is the contrastchecker.com contrast checker website. It does something very similar. I just think that it might be a little bit easier for some users to use. So again, you would just put in your color combination for your foreground and your background. So let's do that 0190dB again. And then we can see the background color is white. We're going to leave it there. It's got our sample text here at 12 point, as well as at 18 point, some paragraph sample text for you in both places. It also has this ability to see it in grayscale, which I think is pretty helpful. And then down here, you just get the big red circle with the X, or the big green circle with that green check mark, or I'm sorry, big green circle with the check mark, letting you know which levels it does or does not pass for. And so they're not using color alone. They have the check mark and the X's as well to let you know whether or not it passes. And you can even see here the point value at which it did pass. So really good, helpful information. I think it's it's great for those users who maybe are a little bit intimidated. They're just getting into this, and they need something that maybe is just a little bit simple as opposed to something that's throwing a ton of information at you all at once. So those are just a handful of the tools that are available that my team either currently uses or we've come across in our research as we have made sure to start taking digital accessibility in mind at the outset as we're building things and as we're designing things for our users across the university. So now that you have this information, what do you do with it? Ask if you're going to be hiring out for design work or for front-end development work for a website or an application, anything along those lines, make sure that the designer or the developer that you're working with is familiar with WCAG 2.1 AA color contrast requirements, as well as just WCAG 2.1 AA compliance across the board. Like, you want to make sure that they're familiar with what these standards are and that they are designing for you with these standards in mind and that they're building for you with these standards in mind. It's very difficult and in some cases impossible to try and retrofit something to be accessible. And that's why you actually see a number of new services being trickled into the university, because as we have been auditing each one of these services and determining, does it just meet our basic needs at the university, but also is it accessible? Can it be retrofitted? Those are some of those deal breaker questions that we're asking of all of the tools that we contract out for or that we build internally ourselves. And if we decide that we need to switch it up, the AA compliance is a deal breaker question that we're always asking. Is it compliant? Can it be made to be compliant? You need to be asking these same things for anybody that you also are contracting with, because just because you didn't build it, just because somebody else owns it, it doesn't mean that we're not responsible for making sure that it's digitally accessible and compliant at the AA level. We are still responsible for it because by purchasing it and by using it, we're basically endorsing it. So we need to make sure that all of our users can use it. So ask if they're familiar with those requirements, and then ask if they will test for those requirements as well. It's not enough for them just to say, yeah, we're familiar with it and we'll keep it in mind. No, as you're going through the process and getting closer to launch and you're testing things, they need to be testing for accessibility. Again, we do this for everything that we design and everything we build. We look at it across multiple browsers. We check the inspector in the browsers. We pop those text values into the color contrast checkers. We're testing it as thoroughly as we possibly can so that when we send it out there in the wild, we're pretty confident that it's going to be accessible for all users. So you need to make sure that if you're paying somebody to design something for you and you're paying somebody to develop something for you, they're familiar with the requirements and they are testing for the requirements. And then finally, use the recommended tools or a different tool of your choice to test internally on your own if you're going to be doing the design or the development in-house. You need to be taking on that responsibility. And again, it's something you need to be thinking about as a part of the process of designing and a part of the process of building. It shouldn't be something where you go through the full process of design or the full process of development and then you say, okay, well now let's also test it for accessibility, because what will end up happening is if it doesn't pass and you have to go back and do a lot of rework, it could throw some serious wrenches into your project. So it should be something that you are keeping in mind from day one of build and day one of design, and making sure that you carry out and keep it in mind throughout the entire process so that at the end, when you're ready to launch, you can also be pretty confident that whatever you've designed or whatever you've built is going to meet these accessibility requirements. So that's actually everything that I have for you guys today on the agenda, but I want to open up the floor. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat. You can also take yourself off mute and feel free to ask your question that way. If you do want to put it into the chat, please be aware that my colleague Annette Thompson is also signed into the WebEx, and you can ask her or me questions directly. We're both happy to answer them for you. So yeah, let me know if you have any questions. I'm opening up the floor. So how do you manage situations with text over images? So if this is something that you've designed in-house, or if it's something that our team has designed, bring it to our attention. If it's not accessible, we are absolutely happy to take a look at it. If it's something where you're designing in-house or you're having somebody design it for you, you need to make sure that you're picking those color contrast or color combinations that will meet contrast requirements. And I promised you guys that I would show you the color blah, 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 the color combinations. So let me pull that up for you so we can just kind of take a look at what the GW color palette looks like. But it really, again, it is a matter of picking color combinations that you know are going to meet accessibility requirements. Let me pull this up for you. So these are the GW web colors. This is the document that will be shared with you all. They're the primary colors, the secondary colors, and then if you go past this first page, you'll see that there are these colors under a contrast test. These are the ones that have gone through a higher standard of color contrast testing, but we have also made sure that these colors up here, the primary and the secondary, have also been tested. The ones that have the star, let me make this a little bit bigger because I know it's small. So these are the base core primary colors. You can see here that we have some alternatives for you, lighter shades and darker shades, that we know will work better. So for the light blue cyan, which is my personal favorite, but not necessarily accessible across the board, we will frequently use 0073AA color hex value instead, because we know that this one will pass accessibility compliance more often than text does. So when we are putting text on top of a graphic, we make sure that we're using the accessible hex value, or we're tweaking it as necessary until it does meet that requirement where the background color and the foreground text color have enough contrast between the two of them. So don't feel like you can't put text on images. You absolutely can. You just have to make sure you're using appropriate color contrast combinations. Is there any way to access the presentation document outside of the meeting to use as a guide? Absolutely. I'm going to be sending everybody an email who registered for today's session. You'll be getting a link to the video. You'll be getting a link to the slides, and you'll also be getting the document that we're looking at now so that you can take a look, so that you can basically have these as tools as you're designing your various assets. Anyone else? Okay. So again, that's all I have for you guys. I do want to I do want to let you know, there was a question. You're not expected to become designers by this. I am not a designer. I can fumble my way through Photoshop, but really what it comes down to is just recognizing that there are standards that have to be met. And as you're thinking about what it is that you're putting out there, whether you're the one who's actually designing it, whether you're the decision maker, if you are instructing somebody else to design something, these are the things that have to be kept in mind when those items are being created. So that, you know, if something gets presented to you and you say, I just don't like it, but they say to you, well, this is what I had to do because it's accessible, that's when you kind of have to say, oh, okay, well, again, beauty is important, but usability is the priority. So maybe it's not as pretty as I want it to be, but we know that it's going to meet the accessibility requirements, and that's the priority. Like, that has to take the priority. So those are the things to keep in mind. We don't expect you all to become, you know, Photoshop experts and design experts. I am neither. But I make sure that I keep these things in mind for everything. That anytime somebody asks me to take a look at something, I'll say, oh, you know, it's really pretty, but I know that this isn't going to work if somebody maybe has a color blindness issue, or, you know, that's a really cool looking interface you designed, but I know that if somebody has a motor disability, they won't be able to see that stuff that's hidden behind mouse hover only. So those are the things that you have to keep in mind when it comes to digital accessibility. You can't force and control the way that somebody's going to see your content and interact with your content. So you need to make sure that nothing is restricted from them or withheld from them because you've designed it in a way that can only be accessed if you do it just this one way that I thought about. It has to be a little more open so that it can be more accessible to everybody. So thank you again for joining me. If you do have any questions that weren't covered today, or you just didn't want to ask them in the chat or take yourself off mute, feel free to reach out to my team. You can email us at onlinestrategy@gwu.edu. You can also take advantage of our office hours. We are in Gelman Library in the basement level, B01, for the remainder of the summer. And then in the fall semester, I believe it's going to be in Hall of Government Room 103. That is Thursday, every day from 10 till noon. So for the summer, Gelman B01 down in the basement level. And then come fall, we'll be in Hall of Government Room 103. Those are both computer labs, so you don't have to bring a laptop unless you want to. There will be computers on site that you can use. We also offer virtual office hours daily from 11 to noon. They do require appointments. They're 30-minute sessions apiece. And you can register for those on our site, onlinestrategy.gwu.edu. So thank you again, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.